Hello. In this presentation, we will look at the poem Landscape of the Capibaribe River by the Brazilian poet João Cabral de Melo Neto. This poem is part of a much longer poem by him titled The Dog Without Feathers, which was published in 1950. The poem was initially written in Portuguese and it was translated into English by Richard Zenith. João Cabral de Melo Neto was a Brazilian poet and diplomat. He was born in 1920 and died in 1999. He grew up in the sugar plantations in a region called Pernambuco in Brazil. This is a place in northeastern Brazil. And he was born and brought up in a city called Recife, Recife. It's pronounced Recife in Portuguese, which is a place in Pernambuco. Cabral, as he is popularly known, was part of a group of poets who wrote after the Second World War and were known as the Generation of 45. His poetry is objective and unsentimental, and it is defined by its use of concrete, tactile nouns. That means nouns that refer to concrete objects, material objects, tactile, that which can be touched. And Cabral believed that a poet is like an engineer designing a building. So a poet does not just write whatever comes to mind. He doesn't just express his emotions in a spontaneous overflow, but he's like an engineer. He's like an architect who plans and designs a building and then builds it up brick by brick. And these concrete tactile nouns are some of the bricks that the poet uses. The images that the poet uses are the bricks for building that construction. Now, the Capibaribe River in the title of the poem refers to a river that is located in the Pernambuco state in northeastern Brazil. The soil of this river was suitable for the cultivation of sugarcane, and this led to the rise of the sugar plantations and sugar mills in Pernambuco. Cabral was born in a landowning family in Pernambuco, so he grew up around these sugar plantations. But he was also a very socially aware poet, which means that he was aware of the difficulties of life faced by the poor people, the working class people of these plantations. Now we will move on to the poem and we will try to analyze it stanza by stanza. Landscape of the Capibaribe River. The city is crossed by the river as a street is crossed by a dog, a piece of fruit by a sword. In this first stanza, the poet describes how the river, the Capibaribe River, crosses the city. He doesn't mention which city, but it is probably referring to Recife. The city is crossed by the river. That is the main point he's trying to make here, and he is comparing it to one or two things. What are these images? He is using two similes. The city is crossed by the river as a street is crossed by a dog. This is the first simile. A dog crosses a street. And the second one, a piece of fruit by a sword. A piece of fruit is being crossed by a sword. Now, these two images bring us the idea of both movement and cutting or dividing. When a dog crosses the street, the dog is moving across the street. When a sword crosses a piece of fruit, the sword is cutting or dividing that piece of fruit into two pieces. Similarly, when the river crosses the city, it is moving across the city, it is also cutting the city or dividing the city into two parts. Now pay attention to this image of the dog. This is a primary image that the poet uses throughout this poem. And if you remember, this poem is part of a longer poem called The Dog Without Feathers. More on that later. Now, next stanza. The river called to mind a dog's docile tongue, or a dog's sad belly, or that other river which is the dirty wet cloth of a dog's two eyes. The river called to mind. The river called certain things to the poet's mind, which means that when the poet sees the river, he remembers a few things. Now, what are these things? So, all these things are related to a dog. So, now he's going to list a few things, three things actually, that come to the poet's mind when he sees the river: a dog's docile tongue, or a dog's sad belly, or that other river. Now, what are these things? First of all, the docile tongue of a dog. Docile means obedient. A dog's obedient tongue. Or a dog's sad belly. Belly means stomach. Why is the dog's belly sad? Maybe because the dog is hungry, it's not eaten anything. And we'll come to that third image in a moment. But let us look at these two usages: docile tongue and sad belly. Now, how can a tongue be docile? How can a tongue be obedient? How can a stomach be sad? Actually, it is not the tongue that is docile, it is the dog that is docile. Similarly, it is not the belly that is sad, it is the dog that is possibly sad. So, docile and sad are adjectives that actually refer to the noun dog, but they are being transferred to other words like tongue and belly. This is an example of what could be called a transferred epithet. A transferred epithet is a figure of speech. Epithet means an adjective, something which describes a noun. The words docile and sad are adjectives, they are epithets. They should belong to, they should describe the noun dog, but instead they are transferred to the nouns tongue and belly respectively. Therefore, these are examples of a transferred epithet. Now, we move on to the third image in that stanza. That other river, which is the dirty wet cloth of a dog's two eyes. It's a little complex, but what the poet is doing is he's actually adding certain comparisons. He's saying that the river, the Capibaribe river, is like that other river. It's like some other river. Which is that other river? Which is the dirty wet cloth of a dog's two eyes. He's saying that, see, if you take a wet cloth, a dirty wet cloth, suppose you have some dirty water, then that water will drip from the cloth. And if it drips from the cloth, it might look like a river. A tiny river, but a river nevertheless. But what is this wet cloth? It is also an image. He says that it is the dog's eyes which are the dirty wet cloth from which that other river is dripping. So you can imagine water dripping from a dog's eyes. This is compared to water dripping from a dirty wet cloth. And this is the other river that he is talking about. So the Capibaribe river reminds the author of another river, which is basically the water dripping from a dog's eyes, just like water dripping from a dirty wet cloth. Here we have a kind of three-layered image. First, the Capibaribe river is compared to that other river. Then we get to know that river is the water dripping from the dog's eyes. And then we also have a comparison of this water to water dripping from a wet cloth. So it's a three-layered image. Here you can see an example of how the poet uses images as building blocks towards creating his poem. So this is an example of how the poet functions as an engineer. Next stanza. The river was like a dog without feathers. It knew nothing of the blue rain, of the rose-colored fountain, of the water in a water glass, of the water in pitchers, of the fish in the water, of the breeze on the water. The river was like a dog without feathers. Feathers are not something that you associate with dogs. Feathers are something you associate with winged creatures. Birds have feathers. Dogs have fur. They don't have feathers. So, what is this dog without feathers? A dog without feathers is just a dog, right? Whereas a dog with feathers is something else altogether, something marvelous. Feathers and a dog don't go together. So here he's talking about perhaps two things. The dog refers to the life of the ordinary people. It is full of deprivation, it is full of poverty, and the river is also like that. Whereas feathers would refer to beautiful things, something ornate, ornamental, beautiful, and feathers have no place on a dog. The river itself is like a dog without feathers, just like the poor people living near the river, living on the banks of the river, in poverty, in deprivation, are also like dogs without feathers. We can even say that the poem of this poet is like a dog without feathers, because it is without too much ornamentation. It is not a pretty poem. He's not only talking about beautiful things, he's talking about the difficult life of the people. He's talking about the river, which is not a very beautiful thing. Now, he's not talking about the river in a very idealistic manner or just talking about its beauty, just praising how beautiful it is. That's not what he's doing. So maybe the poem itself is a dog without feathers. You can think about that. Moving on. So the river was like a dog without feathers. And these are the things. He makes a list of the things that it knows nothing of. And in the next stanza, he's going to list the things that the river actually might know about. So what are the things that the river does not know about? The blue rain, the rose-colored fountain, water in a water glass, water in pitchers, fish in the water, the breeze on the water. These are all images to do with water. So the river is composed of water. It is made of water, but there is water and there is water. There are different types of water, and the river knows nothing about certain types of water. the blue rain, rose-colored fountain. These are all beautiful images of water. What is blue rain? The rain is not actually blue, but when you draw rain, it actually looks blue. When you draw a river, it looks blue. And that blue color that you give it is something very idealistic. It has nothing to do with the actual color of the water. So here he might be talking about the difference between representation and reality. How do you represent the river? How do you depict or portray the river? Is that the real river? Or is that just your imagination of the river? Is that just something that you have built up in your mind? Whereas the actual river may be something else altogether. Then he goes on to talk about water in a water glass or in a pitcher. Both of these are water that is meant to be drunk. So you have kept water in a glass to drink, or you have kept water in a pitcher. A pitcher means a jar. You pour water from the pitcher into the glass and then you drink it. And you don't drink dirty water, you drink only pure water. So these are images of purity. The fish in the water. The fish in the water, if there is fish in the water, then there is life in that water. The fish move around in a very lively manner. Later in the poem, he will describe the movement of that fish even more, but you can imagine the brightness of the flashing fins of the fish in the water, the brilliance of that fish in the water, the quick movements, the liveliness of the fish. Or the breeze on the water, the wind that is moving the surface of the water, that is also movement. So liveliness, movement, purity, beauty, these are all things that the poor Capibaribe river knows nothing about. What then does the river know? It knew the crabs of mud and rust. It knew silt like a mucous membrane. It must have known the octopus and surely knew the feverish woman living in oysters. It knew the crabs of mud and rust. It knew the crabs. Now, crabs don't swim in water. Crabs crawl on the very bed of the river. They crawl under the water. They crawl in the mud and the rust and the silt that has accumulated under the water. It knew silt. What is silt? Silt refers to the sand or mud or clay or any other material that is carried by running water, that is carried by the river and which is deposited as a sediment. So this silt is something, maybe it is dirty, maybe it is muddy, it is something that the river has been carrying with it all this while, and perhaps it has deposited it at the banks of the river. It knew silt like a mucous membrane. A mucous membrane means the thin skin that covers the inside surface of parts of the body like the nose and the mouth, and it produces a substance called mucus. So when you sneeze, what comes out of your nose, that is mucus, and that is again not a very it's not at all a beautiful image, a mucous membrane. So the river knows silt as if it is a mucous membrane. It is very much a part of it, but it is not a beautiful part of it at all. It must have known the octopus and surely knew the feverish woman living in oysters. The octopus, maybe, instead of fish, you have the crabs and the octopus, which are not at all beautiful, but which are the kind of lives that are living inside this river. So there is a life system, there is a life world, there is an ecosystem inside this river, but it is not the pretty flashing fish, but it is the crabs and the octopus. And what is this feverish woman living in oysters? Women don't live in oysters. Usually inside the oysters you have pearls, but he is comparing the pearl living in oysters to a feverish woman. So it is not that Cabral's poems don't have images It's not like they don't have imagination. They have. This is an example of his imagination, where he compares the pearl inside an oyster to a feverish woman who is living inside the oyster, almost like an illegal migrant, almost like somebody who's hiding, who doesn't have any other place to live. Next stanza. The river never opens up to fish, to the shimmer, to the knifely unrest existing in fish. It never opens up in fish. Just as we said that the river doesn't know the fish swimming in the water, it is not the kind of water in which the lively movement of fish can be seen. Similarly, the river never opens itself up to fish. So, just like the river cannot know fish, fish cannot know the river either. And this is how the fish move. They shimmer. Shimmer means that they gleam. They give off color, they give off light, they reflect light. The scales of the fish reflect light, and so when the fish move very quickly, it looks as if they are shimmering, as if they are shining, glowing. To the knifely unrest existing in fish, you don't normally see fish sitting still. They always keep moving around. They are not at rest, they are at unrest. They are always moving very quickly. The knifely unrest. The fish are their movements are very sharp, like the movement of a knife. It never opens up in fish. So the river never opens up to fish, it never opens up in fish. So the river doesn't understand the fish, and the fish don't understand the river either. But what does the river open up to? It opens up in flowers, poor and black, like black men and women. It opens up into a flora as squalid and beggarly as the blacks who must beg. It opens up in hard-leaved mangroves, kinky as a black man's hair. It opens up in flowers, but these are not again beautiful flowers, pink and red and lavender and all kinds of colors. These flowers are also poor and black. So whatever flowers exist in the ecosystem of the river are also poor and black, just like black men and women. The black men and women are probably the poor working class people who live on the banks of the Capibaribe river and who work in the sugar plantations. So the flowers that grow in the ecosystem of the river are just like the black men and women. It opens up into a flora. Flora means the plants in a particular geographical region. So the river has its own flora. It has a particular set of plants that grow around it. But these plants are squalid and beggarly. Squalid means they look extremely dirty, mostly as a result of poverty. So the very flowers and the plants living near the river look squalid, they look dirty, they look very poor and beggarly. Beggarly means like beggars, as just like the blacks who must beg. So the blacks who live there are also very poor and they have to beg for their daily existence. And he is comparing the very flora, the very plants that grow near the river to the blacks. It opens up in hard-leaved mangroves, kinky as a black man's hair. Mangrove refers to a kind of tropical tree that is found near water. The roots of the mangroves grow partly under the ground, under the water, and partly above the ground. You can see mangroves in India in the Sundarbans in West Bengal. There are other mangroves also, but these are the most famous mangroves in India. And the mangroves that grow on the side of this river are kinky. Kinky means curly, like a black man's hair. Smooth like the belly of the pregnant dog, The river swells without ever bursting. The river's childbirth is like a dog's, fluid and invertebrate. Invertebrate means without a spine. Now he is comparing the river to the belly, to the stomach of a pregnant dog. The river swells without ever bursting. So it keeps swelling and swelling, just like the stomach of a pregnant dog would keep swelling. But it doesn't burst. It's not like a balloon that it swells and bursts. It is like the pregnant dog's belly, which keeps swelling, it keeps getting bigger and bigger, but there is no relief in bursting. The river's childbirth is like a dog's, fluid and invertebrate. Just like the dog giving birth, when the river gives birth, it is also fluid. Fluid means flowing, and it is invertebrate. It is probably referring to how during the high tide or during the rainy season, the river swells, it becomes much bigger, maybe it floods, and then again probably it moves in different directions to different tributaries, little smaller rivers branching off from the main river, etc. And I never saw it seethe as bread when rising seethes. In silence, the river bears its bloating poverty, pregnant with black earth. Now, seethe means to feel anger and be unable to express it. I never saw the river seething. The river must have a lot of anger within it, just like the poor black people living and working there have a lot of anger because of their social conditions. But I never saw the river seething. I never saw the river struggling to contain that anger. And the seething, he's comparing that to the sound made by bread that is rising. So when you try to make bread, you put yeast in it so that the bread rises. So when it rises, there is a slight. It's like it rises, but it doesn't go out of the container. He's comparing that to the seething of the river. Possibly the river seethes, but I have never seen it seething. In silence, the river bears its bloating poverty. Bloating means swelling. The poverty of the river is swelling, just like a pregnant dog, as we mentioned earlier. And what is it pregnant with? It is pregnant with black earth. So, like the silt that the river is carrying with it, it is also carrying black earth. And it is carrying this burden, this heavy burden of black earth, which is its poverty, which is what causes it to swell. It is carrying this burden in silence. So it may be angry that it is polluted by all the silt and mud and dirt and rust and all those things, but it doesn't express any of those things. It carries all these burdens in silence. It yields in silence. It surrenders in silence. It yields in silence, in black earthen caves, in black earthen boots or gloves for the foot or hand that plunges in. The river has brought all this black earth, all this pollution, and now it is lying like silt on the sides. And when you step into it, when you put your foot into it or your hands into it, then when you pull your hand or foot out of the water, your hand or foot is covered with this black earth, and that makes it look as if you are wearing black earthen boots or gloves. As sometimes happens with dogs, the river seemed to stagnate. Its waters would turn thicker and warmer, flowing with the thick, warm waves of a snake. Now, again, he's comparing the river to dogs, and he's saying that sometimes the same thing happens to both dogs and rivers. They stagnate. What is stagnate? Stagnate means to stay the same and not to move. So sometimes when you put something in a corner of the room, or a dog sits in one place without moving, that dog is stagnating. Or that object which you put there is stagnating. If you look at the water of a pond, for example, or water that is collected in a vessel that you have kept outside in the rain, that water is stagnant water. It is stagnating, it is not moving. But a river is not supposed to be like that. And the stagnant water will always be dirty as well. Whereas the river, because it flows, its waters are supposed to be cleaner. But this river seems to stagnate sometimes, just like what sometimes happens with dogs. Now, dogs are also living beings, right? So they also run around and they're not supposed to stagnate. But sometimes this happens with both dogs and rivers. That is what the poet says. And how does it stagnate? Its waters would turn thicker and warmer. Why are the waters thicker? Because it is polluted. It is carrying all the silt and earth along with it. So the river water is supposed to be very clear. It is supposed to be very cool. It is supposed to flow very easily. But here, because the waters are thick with the silt and the earth and the pollution that it has been carrying around, the water cannot flow very quickly. It flows with the thick, warm waves of a snake. So now the river flows like a snake. A snake moves in a very zigzag manner, and that is exactly how the river also moves. But just like the snake, a snake also may not move very quickly. The snake, precisely because it moves in a zigzag manner, it moves in a slightly slower manner. Just like that, the river has stagnated because of all the pollution in it. Its waters have become thick and it is difficult for the river to move very quickly. It had something of a crazy man's stagnation, something of a something of the stagnation of hospitals, prisons, asylums, of the dirty and smothered life, dirty, smothering laundry it trudged through. Now, the stagnation of the river was earlier compared to the stagnation of a dog. Now he is comparing it to the stagnation of a crazy man. A crazy man doesn't live like other ordinary human beings. If a person is crazy, people, so they remain stagnant. Something of the stagnation of hospitals, prisons, asylums. Now, what is common to these three places? Hospitals, they are places where sick people are confined, and the idea is that they are being treated, they are being made better, but they actually suffer there. Prisons, people who have done some crime, something that is considered wrong by society, something illegal, they are put in prison, they are confined there. The idea is again that they will be made better by their tenure in prison, but they also suffer there. Asylums. Here, asylum refers to mental hospitals, mental asylums. Again, this is a confining space for people with mental problems, people who are mentally ill. They also suffer there. So, all these three places, hospitals, prisons, and asylums, are places that are supposed to make people better. But these are places where people suffer in stagnation. Many times, because these hospitals, prisons, and asylums, especially in underdeveloped countries or developing countries, don't have the necessary infrastructure to make all the people better. So they stagnate, they suffer, and they become dirty. Just like an object that is stagnant becomes dirty, just like the river, when it is stagnant, becomes dirty, these people also become dirty. But this is not dirty in a physical sense. There's something, some kind of pollution or corruption enters their minds and their souls, so that their spirit becomes polluted, their mind becomes polluted and dirty. They live a smothered life. Smother means to not be able to breathe. When you are being smothered, you are unable to breathe properly. So this is a kind of suppressed, oppressed life. when you're completely smothered, you feel that you are so suffocated by the difficulties of your life that you are unable to breathe. This is the kind of life that is led by the ordinary people, the working people, the black people living in Pernambuco, and their life is being compared to the life of the river. Dirty smothering laundry when you wash clothes and then you hang them out to dry. So the laundry, the process of washing is supposed to clean the clothes, but those clothes also become dirty because if you don't have a clean place to keep those clothes, they also become dirty. So the lives of these people are like that. They're trying so hard to become better, they're trying so hard to better their conditions, they're trying so hard to become clean in a sense, but they are unable to. The kind of lives to which they are condemned, the way that society always keeps them poor, these are some of the factors that result in these poor people being unable to live a better life. So they feel smothered, they feel dirty, just like the river. The smothered life it trudged through. Trudge means to walk slowly and with effort. So, as I mentioned earlier, because the river is thick and it is full of pollution, it is full of dirt and silt and all kinds of things, it is unable to move very quickly. So it is trudging along, it is moving very slowly and with difficulty through the river banks where these people live. And their life is also a kind of trudge. Just like the life of the river, just like the movement of the river, the lives of the people who live on the banks of the river in Pernambuco, also their life is also a very slow and difficult trudge. Something of the stagnation of decayed palaces eaten by mold and mistletoe. Something of the stagnation of obese trees dripping 1,000 sugars from the Pernambuco dining rooms it trudges through. Something, now this river has something of the stagnation of decayed palaces. Palaces, decayed palaces. Palaces which were once very beautiful and magnificent, but now over time nobody is living in them, nobody is taking care of them, and now they have deteriorated, they have decayed, they are starting to fall apart, they are becoming dirty. And the river is compared to those decayed palaces. So maybe long ago the river too was beautiful, it was mighty, and it was lovely, just like those palaces. But now, like those decayed palaces, it has also become very dirty and corrupted. It is these decayed palaces are eaten by mold and mistletoe. Mold refers to a soft green or grey growth that develops on old food. So if you take a piece of bread and you keep it for a long time, you will see that it develops mold, pupil. Or on objects that have been left for too long in the warm, wet air. If you keep things without properly storing them or refrigerating them, they develop mold. So, like that, these decayed palaces are being corrupted by mold. And mistletoe is a kind of evergreen plant. I have given a picture of mistletoe here. It's an evergreen plant with yellow flowers which is used as a Christmas decoration. And these palaces are being, because nobody is looking after them, this mistletoe plant is growing all over the palaces. So the palaces are falling apart, they are eaten by mold, and all kinds of creepers and climbers are climbing over the walls of the palace. That is the image that he creates, and he says that the stagnation of the river is like the stagnation of such decayed palaces. The second part of the stanza gives us another image of stagnation. Something of the stagnation of obese trees dripping 1,000 sugars from the Pernambuco dining rooms it trudges through. So the river is trudging along, and somewhere on the side of the river there are the trees, obese trees. Obese means very fat. dripping 1,000 sugars. Now, what are these trees that are dripping sugar into the water? And the here sugar is not considered a very nice thing. Sugar is thick, and it is something that seems to be stagnant and polluting the river again. So these may not refer to actual trees, because sugar comes from sugar cane or from maple trees, and these may not be referring to the actual trees or plants in the plantation. But some critics have mentioned that the obese trees dripping 1,000 sugars mentioned by the poet in the stanza refer to the sugar factories. So he is comparing the factories to trees. So the factories on the side of the river release all the contamination, all the pollution after creating sugar. When they make sugar, they also have a lot of pollution, a lot of waste materials that they want to release, and they release that into the river. That is how the river becomes stagnant again. Something of the stagnation of obese trees dripping 1,000 sugars from the Pernambuco dining rooms it trudges through. Now, what are these dining rooms that he's talking about? The Pernambuco dining rooms. Who has dining rooms? Not everyone has a dining room. Dining room is something that you associate with the middle class or the upper class or the wealthy people. So the rich people, the wealthy people of Pernambuco need sugar for their dining rooms, and these factories are producing sugar for these wealthy people or these privileged people, and they are as a byproduct of this production, they are dumping waste into the river, and this waste is what sediments on the sides or the banks of the river, and the poor people, the poor black people of Pernambuco have to live and walk and work amid this waste. It is there, with their backs to the river, that the city's cultured families brood over the fat eggs of their prose. In the complete peace of their kitchens, they viciously stir their pots of sticky indolence. And now here he is talking about, he's giving us an image of the Pernambuco dining rooms. So it is in these dining rooms and kitchens that the cultured families of the city, these cultured families are the rich people, they turn their backs to the river. They don't look at the river, they don't acknowledge what is happening to the river, they don't care about the river anymore. So the pollution of the river is not something that bothers them. Only the poor people, the black people, are bothered by the pollution, and their lives and the lives of the river become similar. So both the black people and the river are exploited by the rich people. So what do the cultured families do? They brood over the fat eggs of their prose. So this is again an image that he is using. Just like when the hen sits on the eggs in order to hatch those eggs, that is considered that is called brooding. So brood has one meaning there, when the hen sits on an egg to warm it and make it hatch into little chickens. That is called brooding. But brooding also means thinking in a very serious manner. So the cultured families of the city, the rich people, they believe that they are very cultured, they are very sophisticated. And what they do is they sit and brood, think over their prose. They sit and read prose and poetry and all kinds of things, and they are actually like these hens that are brooding over eggs. But here the eggs are the prose. So the cultured families think that we are highly educated, we are sophisticated, and we are creating a lot of prose and poetry. So they sit and write, and they think about what they are writing, then they read it again, they do all these things. But all this is possible for them because they turn their backs towards the river. In the complete peace of their kitchens, they viciously stir their pots of sticky indolence. Indolence means idleness, being idle. That is indolence. So there is something and it is also a kind of indulgence. You can even imagine that word here. So they are lazy, they don't work very hard. Indolence means idleness or laziness, so they don't work very hard, and the sugar that they are stirring in their pots in the kitchen are sticky, and this he is comparing the stickiness of the sugar to the laziness of these people. So now we can see two images of stagnation or not moving very quickly. The river is stagnant, like the dog is stagnant or the poor people are stagnant because they are not allowed to move very fast, because they are forced to carry all this pollution which is not created by them, it is created by the rich people, but the river and the poor people are forced to bear the burden of this pollution. Because of that, the river is stagnant and the lives of these people are stagnant. But the lives of the rich people are also stagnant, and this is, they are stagnant because they are lazy, they don't want to move, they are indulgent, they are indolent, they are lazy, and they just want to enjoy their lives. They don't need to care about what is happening to the people outside, what is happening to the river. So the environmental degradation that is caused by the sugar plantations, the exploitation of nature, or the exploitation of the poor black people is not a problem that bothers the rich, cultured families of Pernambuco. Could the river's water be the fruit of some tree? Why did it seem like ripened water? Why the flies always above it as if about to land? Now he's asking this question, why is it that the river's water doesn't seem like water at all? Water is supposed to be clear, it is supposed to be pure, drinkable, it is supposed to flow very easily, but this water is thick. Maybe it is ripened water. Maybe it is like if you take some tropical fruit like jackfruit or mango or something, and the juice of that fruit, if the fruit falls and the juice of that fruit flows out, the juice will be very thick. So maybe the water is behaving not like water but like the ripened juice of some fruit. So maybe it is behaving like ripened water, because not because the water is tasty like juice, but because if a fruit falls and the juice flows out, there will be flies around it circling in the air about to land on it and taste the stickiness. Just like that, there are so many flies always around this river. So why the flies always above it as if about to land? So here the poet is comparing the river to the fruit or the juice of some tropical fruit, not because it is tasty, not because it is nice, but because it is always surrounded by flies. Did any part of the river ever cascade in joy? Was it ever anywhere a song or fountain? Why then were its eyes painted blue on maps? This is the last stanza where, after saying all these things, the poet starts to question why the river is considered a river at all. Did any part of the river ever cascade in joy? To cascade means to pour down quickly, rapidly, like a waterfall. The river is supposed to move very quickly, like a waterfall, like a spring. It is supposed to move as if it is bubbling in joy. Did any part of the river ever cascade in joy? Was this river always like this? Was it always so dark and thick and corrupted and polluted? Or was there ever a time when the river was happy, when the river was clear and pure and it cascaded, it flowed very quickly? Was it ever anywhere a song or fountain? Song, fountain, these are again beautiful images. Did the river ever flow very smoothly like a song? Was it ever clear and beautiful like a fountain? And he seems to think, no. The answer to these questions for the poet seems to be no. The river You can't even imagine. Now the river is so polluted that you cannot imagine a time when it cascaded in joy. You cannot imagine a time when it was pure and clear and beautiful and unpolluted. So if the river that we see today is so thick and dirty and full of black earth, full of silt and mud and all kinds of pollution, then the river cannot be blue. The river must be actually dark in color. Why then were its eyes painted blue on maps? So here he is personifying the river, and as if the bright blue color of the river is the shining blue color of its eyes. Why then were its eyes painted blue on maps? If you look at a map, whenever there is a river, it will be given a blue color. Now, the person making the map does not think about whether the actual river is blue or not, whether the actual river is polluted or not. So, in a map, how we represent the river is always as blue, but the actual river is not blue. So, the maps don't pay any attention to the maps don't pay justice to the actuality, the reality of the river, which is corrupted, which is polluted. So why is there such a distinction? Why is there such a distinction between the reality of the river and its representation? And the eyes painted blue, this is an interesting image, because whose eyes are blue? Our eyes are not blue. The eyes of Indians or Africans or many people in the world are not blue. Only the eyes of a certain section of white people are blue. So, blue eyes are considered to be very beautiful, but they are actually the property of certain race. So, considering blue eyes as beautiful is also a racial thing. Just because somebody's eyes are black or brown or some other color doesn't mean they are not beautiful. But somehow, in all the representations that we have, it is only blue eyes that are supposed to be beautiful. So, here we can also see that while the poet is talking about the pollution of the river, the exploitation of nature, and the exploitation of the poor factory workers or the poor people living in Pernambuco by the rich people, he's also clearly making a distinction between a racial distinction between these people. The cultured families living in the Pernambuco dining rooms, who live a rich and lazy life, who don't bother about anything outside their own life, they are white people. And we have already mentioned that the poor people who are forced to engage with, who are forced to interact with this dirty river, whose lives are also as dirty, as polluted, as mothered as the river, they are all black people. So there is a comparison between the black earth that is carried by the river and the lives of those black people. On the other hand, everybody thinks that a river is a cradle of civilization. A river is something that causes the land near it to become very fertile. So we have a very idealized or romanticized idea about a river in our mind, just like the blue eyes that are considered to be an ideal of beauty, or the blue lines on a map that we use to represent a river. But all these are our ideal images of a person or of a river or of a certain kind of existence. This representation, this idealization that we have, has nothing to do with the actual reality. And the poet seems to want to foreground the actual reality of the Capibaribe River and the actual reality of the lives of the poor black people in Portugal, in Pernambuco, who live on the banks of this river.